congressional seat, and really, at that point, really was trying to figure out what is it that God really wants me to do for the rest of my life. The time in Washington was great, but yet at the end of the day, how was I using the gifts and the talents that God was giving me to really expand His kingdom? So from that point on, I spent a few years, quite honestly, during the early days of what we called Create Possible. My brother and I established roaming around actually different countries outside the United States. And so what happened was funders would come to us and said, hey, look, we funded a ministry or an organization in Iraq or Egypt or Peru, South Africa, some of these other countries. Can you come alongside of them and help them with their capacity? And so what I found was actually there were a lot of needs. There were a lot of really great ideas that were actually happening in some of these countries outside the United States. The problem that we don't realize sometimes is that as Westerners, we're so generous, not just with our time, but our finances, that what we don't realize is by introducing or by even giving, let's say, $500,000 or even $10,000 into a society that's never seen that money before, you've changed the fabric of their society. And so what happens is instead of them learning what it means to be sustainable and developing good, healthy organizations supported by local individuals in those countries, you create dependence on the donors here in the United States. And so I came back after roaming around the world and still do that most of my summers and took over an organization called Good City Chicago. Good City's been around for about 30 years, and for 30 years, what it's done is really helped us start ministries, organizations in what they call low-income areas in the city of Chicago. And so when I took it over, they've incubated and started close to about 300 organizations. 50% of those organizations to this day is actually still operating and still doing good work. But what we found, and this was actually really interesting, only 20% of that 50% are actually what we call sustainable. That meant that they were actually bringing in consistent money. That meant that they were healthy. That meant that they were actually people, if I was a donor, that I would want to put money into and support, right? Like a lot of them, we just assumed that by starting their organization in one of these neighborhoods, that they knew how to grow, and that really wasn't the case. And as a result, most of these groups are always looking for money or always dependent on either a major donor or government to support them, and they have never developed sustainable organizations. And so I guess one of the things that we started thinking about is what does sustainability look like in some of these neighborhoods, especially in some of the impoverished neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. And we figured out 4 things that we decided that we're gonna really focus on, and we learned from our time working with these groups. I think the first thing that we recognized is that there is true innovation that's going on in some of these neighborhoods, right? Like you can't just take an idea from downtown Chicago, an organization downtown Chicago, and plop it into some of these neighborhoods. Because a lot of times they don't understand the culture. They don't understand the identity of the people there. But there's really good, innovative ideas that's actually happening in some of these places like Englewood and Bronzeville and Austin. We gotta find them. And usually the ones who you wanna invest in, the ones who are doing some really good work, are not usually the ones that are usually out in the open, right? They're usually working in the trenches. They're usually the quiet ones, and they're usually in the background. So the question became for us, how do we find those individuals? And so what we found is we need to use things like technology to be able to find some of those individuals. We started a thing called IdeaShare a couple of years ago, where we partnered up with a foundation and a corporation to give us some prize money. And so we actually just posed the problem. We said, how do you address, or what idea do you have to address the issue of violence in the city of Chicago? And we said, best idea, we'll give you $2,000. Second best idea, we'll give you $1,000. And third best idea, we'll give you $500. Our job is to help you start those organizations. We actually got almost 450 ideas come through from local individuals that are living in those neighborhoods. Now, 20% of them were actually halfway decent. 80% of them really weren't that good. And so now our job is to be able to help them figure out, how do you incubate some of those ideas? Is it a nonprofit? Is it a for-profit? Do we work with groups like Arloa and Danita's and instead license out the ideas? Or is it better to create your own organization, right? And so sometimes what we found is we can't just allow them, we can't assume that they know how to create their own organization. We can't assume that they have the gifts and the skills to be able to do marketing and IT. And that's one of the things that we always tell people is honestly, it's great that you're giving all this money to these groups, but sometimes your skills is so much more important to the vitality of these groups. And so what does it look like for us to take a new generation of people who's able to invest not just their money, but their time and their talent as well too? So the first stop is there is true innovation that's happening in some of these neighborhoods, right? So that's the first thing. Number two, what we found is actually there needs to be a new model that's being created in some of these neighborhoods. And so what we do is we operate and serve as the back office for a lot of these individuals. And so what we do is we bring in shared resources in terms of development, social media marketing, accounting, IT, and we house it all under one roof, and we provide a discounted service to a lot of these smaller and mid-sized organizations. That honestly is a model for us because it brings in a certain revenue to our organization, and it actually serves them as well too. And so I think the thing that we had to realize is the models that we're creating here locally affects the models that are being created all around the world. And so what does it look like for us to create sustainable models that's working together collaboratively, that's using shared resources to be able to expand upon the work that they're trying to do as well too. So that was the second thing that we learned. How do you use shared resources, but more importantly, create models that represent sustainability both here locally as well as in places outside the United States as well too. The third, I think that we recognize is donors are changing, and the way that we're connecting donors to ministry opportunities have to change as well too. It's interesting, for most of us, we had a generation where a lot of donors would just give to organizations, right? You sat down with them and you said, look, we would love for you to contribute to what we're doing, and for the next 20 or 30 years, they would give. Well, this generation is different. Your generation, 20s, 30s, most of them, 70% of them all want to change the world. 60% of them all want to start their own organizations. And so one of the things that we've found is this particular generation, this next generation, what they're looking for is significance. They want to know that even as an accountant, as an engineer, as a teacher, as a construction worker, that I have significance in the work that I'm doing. But what we found is you have to also remind them that they have a responsibility to invest their time, their money into the communities that they're part of, connect them to the community, and show them the return on investment. It's a different world that we live in now. And most of this generation, this younger generation, are looking for that. They want to know their significance. They want to know that I don't need to go into the nonprofit world or full-time ministry to make a difference as well too. So how then do we connect them to good entrepreneurs who are making a difference in some of these communities? It was funny, so Park is very big on this theology of work. And so what we would usually do is we would host these events where people would come and really understand their connection between their faith and their theology. And at the end of these events, we would ask people to do three things, right? We asked them to commit to being involved in the local ministry. We would ask them to commit to making a difference in their workplace by leading an alpha in the workplace. And we would ask them to join a smaller group where they're able to explore further the theology of their work. What we found sometimes is when we connected them to other organizations, not just ministries, but other organizations, the only thing that they wanted from a lot of these professionals were their donations. Well, that took away from anything that we were saying, because what we were trying to say is you're significant with or without your finances. But a lot of times what we found is nonprofit organizations, at the end of the day, really just wanted donations, money from some of these individuals. And so we had to create a system whereby we were able to mobilize individuals to give not just their money, but their time. So what we did was we started an initiative called Invest Chicago. And it's a theory that you can run philanthropy like a mutual fund, right? So instead of you as an individual giving to an individual organization, you gave to a portfolio of organizations that we manage. And so if you're interested in human trafficking, if you're interested in poverty, if you're interested in health, you would give your money to this particular portfolio. We match it. So everything is matched between government, corporations, and foundations. Because we've found that holistically, you need everybody working together collaboratively to be able to make a difference in a particular neighborhood. Our first fund that we launched was what we called the Women's Innovation Fund. to be able to come alongside 10 women startups in the city of Chicago. Our goal was to raise $130,000 to be able to launch this fund. In 5 months, we raised $190,000. What that showed to us is that you have a generation that wants to make a difference. But what they're looking for is return on investment, and not even an economic, but a social return on investment. And so I think that's something that we as Christians really need to be mindful of as we're looking at what it means to engage with organizations and businesses in these communities. How do we mobilize our money to make a difference? But more importantly, how are we mobilizing our time and our talent? Because I will tell you this, most of the time when government invests in these organizations, they think money alone is going to do it. And I will tell you, money alone is not going to do it. Unless you're working and helping them grow as individuals, helping some of them think through how to manage their family affairs, how to grow as a leader, how to even manage some of the issues that they're facing individually as a leader. We can put all the money in the world in these organizations, but at the end of the day, they're not going to survive. And so that's what we found is you need that element that only Christians value to be able to make a difference, which is the personal element, providing them hope and motivation, and in places where they're working where, honestly, hope and motivation doesn't exist as well, too. And so lastly, the fourth thing that we finally realized in terms of business development in some of these neighborhoods is, I think, at the end of the day, the church needs to be able to respond. And so a new model of church really needs to allow individuals to be able to make a difference. Churches alone are not just being relied to provide spiritual development, but also to be able to provide for the economic development in some of these communities. When we look at issues like immigration, federal government and foundations have already said, you cannot rely on us to be able to pay for these bills. You know, we have all of these individuals who they want to become citizens here, but they've already said, don't rely on us to be able to fund these groups. We don't have enough money anymore. The state is running out of money. The city's running out of money. And what they're saying is that the church is going to need to step up. But until the church really develops a theology around that, a theology around not just economic engagement, but social engagement, utilizing the individuals in our pews, we'll never be able to address some of these issues here as well, too. So something for us to kind of think about as well, too.